My name is David Cohen. I am 62 years old, born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, in the midst of an Orthodox Jewish family that bore the weight and honor of entire generations dedicated to faith. From a very young age, I was exposed to the rigidity and beauty of tradition. My father was a man of few words, but his commitment to the scriptures spoke for him. Every Friday, even before the sun set, our house would transform. The aroma of freshly baked challah, the melody of prayers, the almost musical sound of discussions about the Torah. I grew up in that environment, where questioning was allowed, but doubting that the Messiah was yet to come was almost unthinkable. I graduated from yeshiva with honors, was ordained as a rabbi at 27, and for more than 3 decades, I led a faithful, vibrant community, with families who saw me as a pillar of spiritual stability. My relationship with God was deep, but also formal, like a covenant established with reverence. As for Jesus, he was just a historical detail, a controversial rabbi whom history transformed into a symbol of another faith. I never hated him, but I also never allowed myself to see him as anything more than a figure of the past. That Friday, hours before Shabbat, I was alone in the synagogue, reviewing a drasha I had prepared on the Exodus. I remember the late afternoon light streaming through the stained glass window, tinting the environment with a golden hue that gave me a strange feeling of nostalgia. Perhaps it was the accumulated fatigue, or age beginning to take its toll. But something that afternoon was different. My body seemed heavier than usual, and my thoughts were a bit muddled, as if my mind were operating on another frequency. Suddenly, an intense pain shot through my chest. A warm, overwhelming pain, as if a wall had collapsed upon me. I tried to stand up, but my legs simply gave out. I fell to the ground among the synagogue benches, feeling a high-pitched buzzing in my ears. The pain increased and my vision blurred. The last thing I saw was the door swinging open abruptly and the pale face of the caretaker shouting my name. Then came the sound of sirens. The paramedics arrived quickly, but not quickly enough. My heart had stopped, but my consciousness, it had not departed. On the contrary, I was there, seeing everything, from somewhere above. It was a strange sensation, impossible to describe precisely. I was out of my body, yet still myself, conscious, lucid, without pain. I floated a few meters above the scene, watching the paramedics working with urgency. One of them had a star tattoo on his wrist and kept repeating the word "no" like a mantra as he applied chest compressions. The other, sweating profusely, asked for another charge on the defibrillator. I saw everything with clarity, as if my eyes had gained an impossible sharpness. I could even see a loose thread on the carpet near my body. That was too real to be a dream. But what amazed me most was the calm that enveloped me. There was no panic, no despair, just a profound peace that wrapped around me like a warm blanket on a cold night. I began to notice sounds that did not come from there, a kind of distant music, soft, that did not fit any style I knew. It was as if each note had a life of its own. At that moment, I realized that a presence was approaching, not physically, but in an intense way, like a wave of light carrying consciousness. It was a living, intelligent light, not a blinding light, but one that reveals, and it seemed to know me. This light did not speak in words, but communicated directly with my being. There was no way to hide anything from it. I felt completely exposed, as if every thought, every feeling, every choice in my life were being read in real time by something infinitely greater than I. But surprisingly, there was no judgment. It was like being before someone who knows every one of your mistakes, even those you hide from yourself, and yet loves you, with a love you never knew existed. A love that embarrasses, that dismantles any facade, that heals wounds you didn't even know you carried. The light enveloped me and invited me to follow it. I did not walk, nor did I float. I was carried, as if my very essence were being led by that presence. Around me, everything went dark, but it was not a darkness of fear. It was like a background that further highlighted the intensity of the light. And then, from within it, a figure began to emerge. There was no name, no introduction. I simply knew who it was, and that certainty struck me like a silent lightning bolt. It was him, Jesus, the same one I had spent my whole life ignoring. Seeing Jesus there, so close, so real, was as if my entire world had been turned upside down. He did not need to say anything. His very presence spoke louder than any word. His eyes had a depth impossible to look into for long, not out of fear, but out of reverence. It was as if each glance of his pierced through layers of my soul that I did not even know existed. And yet, there was no fear, only an overwhelming awareness that he knew me completely, and still loved me. The garment he wore was simple, yet it shone with a light that did not come from the outside, but from within. There were marks on his hands, and I knew exactly what they meant, even though I had never believed in those stories. Upon seeing him, everything I had studied all my life began to reorganize within me like pieces of a puzzle. That finally made sense. Verses, symbols, prophecies, all began to point to him. It was as if I had read the Torah in black and white for decades, and suddenly someone turned on the color, and that color had a name, a face, and was right there before me. I wanted to say something, to justify my life, to explain why I had never paid attention to him. But my mouth, if I still had one, would not move, and even if I could speak, I would not know what to say. Jesus needed no explanations. He already knew. And surprisingly, there was no anger in his expression, only compassion, a compassion so deep that it made me cry, not with tears, but with my soul. He extended his hand, and when he touched what I was at that moment, a wave of understanding surged through me. It was not a rational academic knowledge. It was as if he showed me the truth directly, without intermediaries. He took me on a journey where I saw passages of the Torah come to life anew, the Paschal Lamb, the sacrifice of Isaac, the bronze serpent in the desert, the suffering servant of Isaiah. Everything pointed to him. And I, who thought I was knowledgeable about the scriptures, realized that I had only scratched the surface. Jesus did not negate what I believed. He completed it, as if everything I had learned had been a map. And now, I was facing the final destination that this map had always meant to show me. The journey continued in such a way that time seemed no longer to exist. I don't know if minutes or millennia passed. There, everything was eternal and present at the same time. Jesus led me through visions that I could not precisely explain. It was as if I were being taken through spiritual realities, each one more intense and revealing than the previous. At one point I saw something that I believe is heaven. It was not made of clouds and harps, like in cartoons. It was a place of absolute communion, where everything vibrated in harmony. I saw souls, not with bodies like ours, but full of light, at peace, connected to one another by something I cannot describe. There was no ego, pride, fear, or separation there. It was as if everyone knew who they were, and more importantly, knew to whom they belonged. I felt that that was the home my heart had always sought, even without knowing it. And Jesus was at the center of it all, not as a dictator, but as the source of the love that sustained that place. He was the music, the light, the meaning, and everything there existed to glorify him, not out of obligation, but out of pure recognition of the truth. But not everything was consolation and beauty. Jesus also showed me the other side, a place of separation, of deep repentance, of his absence. And that, to me, was the worst of all. Realizing what it would be like to exist far from the one who was the very source of life. I did not see fire or demons with tridents, but I saw souls wandering in pain, enveloped in a lament that did not cease. And it was not a punishment imposed, but a direct consequence of the refusal of the love that Jesus offered. The separation was a continuous echo of decisions made in life. That deeply marked me. I saw faces, expressions of sorrow so authentic that they made me shudder. People who perhaps had lived with good intentions, but never truly wanted to surrender to the truth. Jesus looked at me and, without saying anything, made me understand that his justice is perfect, but also interwoven with mercy. That vision was a call to, responsibility, something that was indelibly imprinted in me. When I looked at him again, I understood that that journey had a purpose. It was not just a revelation, it was a mission, something I should carry back. And I knew, at that moment, that I would not return the same. Jesus then spoke to me without moving his lips, only with his presence. but it was clearer than any sound I had ever heard. He showed me that everything I had experienced as an Orthodox Jew had value, that my love for the Torah, my discipline, my search for God were not in vain. But now I needed to see with different eyes. The Torah was true, but incomplete without him. It was like reading a letter without knowing who wrote it. He showed me that Moses spoke of him, that the Psalms exalted him, and that the prophets announced him. Isaiah, Jeremiah, even Zechariah. Every Jewish holiday that I celebrated pointed to him. Passover, with the flawless lamb. Yom Kippur, with the sacrifice for sin. The very structure of the temple, the veil that separated, the altar, the high priest, all were shadows of a reality that now revealed itself before me. I cried. I cried for not having seen it sooner. I cried for having spent my life waiting for someone who had already come. But even so, Jesus did not accuse me. He embraced me, not physically, but with an acceptance so intense that it healed something within me that I did not even know was wounded. At that moment, I understood that my life would not end there, that I needed to go back. There was something I should do, something he wanted me to say, and that was the hardest part to accept. Returning meant facing my community, my family, my fellow rabbis. It meant being seen as a traitor, a heretic, someone who had lost his mind. But at the same time, there was no choice. After seeing what I saw, after experiencing what I experienced, it would be impossible to remain silent. I would not come back with a new religion, nor with contempt for Judaism, but with eyes open to the fulfillment of the promise. Jesus asked me to be a bridge, not to erase my history, but to use it to reveal the connection that so many still do not see. I felt small, incapable, but he transmitted to me a silent strength, a firm conviction that replaced fear. And then, in an instant, everything disappeared. The light, the music, the presence, and I was pulled back with an almost violent speed. The sensation was of falling, as if I were being sucked into a whirlwind. And then, the pain returned. The sounds, the machines, the screams. I opened my eyes and saw the hospital ceiling. I was surrounded by beeping machines, nurses running, and a doctor who seemed shocked that I was awake. The first thing I did was try to sit up, but my body did not respond properly. It was as if I were trapped between two worlds, as if a part of me were still there. I closed my eyes and everything seemed to echo inside my mind. The eyes of Jesus, the light that knew me, the souls crying out, the visions of the Torah being fulfilled in him. My wife arrived minutes later, her eyes red from so much crying. She held my hand and tried to smile, but she was visibly shaken. I wanted to say everything at once, but my body needed to recover. There were days of hospitalization, tests, and observation. Doctors said that I had only survived by a miracle. "You shouldn't be here," one of them told me seriously. I smiled. They had no idea. The body healed slowly, but my soul was no longer the same. There was a fire within me that burned differently. I knew I needed to speak, with my wife, with my children, with my congregation, with the world. But where to start? How to tell that I had found the Messiah I had always awaited, and yet did not recognize? The conversation with my wife was the first great challenge. She is a devout woman, firm in traditions, with immense faith in the promises of the Torah. When I sat next to her and began to recount what I had experienced, I felt my voice tremble. I spoke calmly, trying not to sound fanatical, but authentic. I told her about the detachment of the body, the living light, the loving presence, and finally, Jesus. The name fell like a stone between us. She cried, first in silence, then uncontrollably. But it was not out of anger. It was out of fear. Fear of what that meant for us, for everything we had built. She did not call me crazy, nor did she reject me. She just asked for time, and I understood. I later spoke with my children, each reacting differently. Shock, disbelief, silence. And then came the congregation. I prepared for days for that sermon. I went up to the pulpit where I had preached hundreds of times before, but with a heavy heart and an exposed soul. When I spoke about the experience, there was an absolute silence. When I mentioned Jesus, some stood up and left, others wept. Some later wrote to me, saying they too felt that something was missing, and it was then that I realized, even among the faithful, There was a thirst for something more. Over time, the reactions intensified. Some community members accused me of apostasy. Others called me a traitor. I lost longtime friends, was uninvited from events, and even some relatives distanced themselves. It was not easy. It hurt like few things in life. But at the same time, something within me remained firm, unshakable. It was as if, since that encounter, a part of eternity had stayed with me. I read the scriptures again with new eyes. Every verse seemed to pulse with a new meaning. The prophets shouted the name I had not heard before. The Psalms whispered truths that now pierced me like sweet arrows. And in all of this, Jesus did not nullify my heritage. He fulfilled it. He did not destroy my identity, but revealed it in its fullness. I became someone between worlds, rejected by some, ignored by others, but sought after by those who, like me, felt that there was something beyond tradition. I began giving discreet lectures, honest conversations. I took calls from curious people, from rabbis in crisis, from Christians who wanted to understand the roots of faith. Gradually, I realized that I was not the only one on this path. There were others, and together, we formed something new, something that, I believe, Jesus himself was building. Today, my life is completely different from what it was before that heart attack. I am no longer the rabbi of a packed synagogue, nor the respected teacher in yeshivas, but I am a witness to something that changed everything. I still observe Shabbat, still celebrate the festivals, still study the Torah, but now every symbol, every rite, points to the one I encountered in that space between life and death. I no longer wait for the Messiah. I have known him, and that certainty accompanies me every day. I do not need a stage or titles. My calling now is another, to be a bridge between the old and the new, between the promise and its fulfillment, between doubt and faith. I often still ask myself, why me? Why did he reveal himself to me, so soon to me, someone who rejected him for so long? But perhaps the answer lies precisely in that, because he truly loves those who deny him, because he is greater than our doctrines, our limits, our logic, because he is the one who said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And I, David Cohen, am just someone who found him too late to turn back, and early enough to live the rest of my life telling this truth.